Today's very special guest is Bilal Harry Khan. Welcome, Bilal. And would you be so kind as to give our listeners and viewers an idea of what you do, please?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on, Mike. My name is Bilal, and I'm a facilitator, particularly in the world of diversity and inclusion. I'm a trainer in that space. I've also got a podcast and do a little bit of writing as well. So I think I'd call myself a facilitator, podcaster, kind of a writer, not really.
I think your blog kind of belies that comment, sir. Oh. So this vlog is around kindness and how important that it is during this crisis, but also with the effects of the Black Lives Matter movement. As this corona crisis became more and more challenging, and it was being reported that corona impacted our BAME communities more significantly. How were you and your community coping with it?
I think there was a lot of fear, if I'm honest, particularly when I think about my parents' age group and all of their friends and my grandparents and people like that. There's so much fear around going outside for one, but also friends and people that we might know getting sick or passing away. And luckily for me, I would say that not too many people who are particularly close were affected in my immediate circle, but there was definitely so much fear around the older people and protecting the older people in our family, protecting the older people in our community, trying to drop them food so that no one had to go outside, trying to make sure that giving everyone a call once a day. Because I think when you read the stats and you see the news, there's just a lot of moral panic, wasn't it? Everyone was terrified.
I know what it was like. I live up here in Dundee, and quite a diverse community. All sorts of different faiths, colours, cultures. It's quite wonderful. If I may, I'd like to touch on the Black Lives Matter movement. I have not experienced, being Caucasian, I've not experienced systemic racism. I have a difficulty in seeing it and understanding it because of white privilege. Could you explain for our viewers and listeners what it means to experience it?
Thank you, Mike, for that honesty and sort of where you're at. I think systemic racism, fortunately, is a thing that affects us all. And by us all, I mean everyone in the world, because there are either people who benefit from its existence or people on the receiving end who just have to face what systemic racism looks like. When people talk about something being systemic, I ask this often in a workshop, what do people mean? What's this? And it is thinking about how an idea that one group of people is better than another is backed up in structures and policies and legislation. And we see that throughout sort of history in regards to racism, with policies and actually law that is designed and created to benefit one group of people over another, which then leads to it sort of being embedded in the systems like the police force, the media, the education system, medicine even. With that leading to real outcomes for people on the receiving end, and those can be outcomes as large as what sort of sparked the Black Lives Matter protest in terms of death, and they can be outcomes on a day-to-day in terms of just having to minimize yourself in conversations or being talked over or seen as of less value, or just people making comments that they think are funny but not actually funny because they're harmful. So I think being on the receiving end of systemic racism is having to, one, acknowledge those more macro sort of, I guess, harsher outcomes in terms of violence and death, but also the recognition that every day there are micro instances of racism in terms of what people might say, how people might perceive you, just things that happen in our school system, in the world of work. which affects the way that you just have to be in the world.
Yeah. On your website, in your blog, you give an example of walking down a London street and someone coming towards you in your lane, a white businessman, and doing that awareness of having to do the two-step and being determined not to move. And from what I understood, you gave that as an example of systemic racism. How does that say, now, I'm in London a great deal and walk London streets and doing the two-step dance all the time.
Yeah.
How does that say racism rather than ignorance?
Yeah, good question. And like you said, walking around London, it feels like you're dancing around London for the most part. There's no space on the street.
Yeah.
But yeah, so what I was writing about in that blog is interesting because I often write things in my blog as a response to just feeling emotional in the moment. And in that moment, it was a recognition of the several times a week, to be honest, that I feel pushed out of like the lane that I'm in. So, you know, when you're walking down a road,
Yeah.
this is my straight path and this is the way that I'm moving down it. And often, you know, there's someone coming towards you. And like you said, you have to move out of the way. Someone sort of gives up and moves out of the way. But there was a recognition of the amount of times a particular demographic of person felt that that was their right to occupy the same space that I'm in. And almost this perceived value of who gets to have the space on the street is such a like interesting dynamics when you look at it. And when I wrote that blog, it was like my personal thing. I wasn't expecting anyone else to care or anyone else to be interested. But I received like several hundred people going, oh my gosh, yeah, I've now, like, that's exactly what I've felt. A lot of women of color, when you think about the intersectionality of that experience too, what it means to be a woman or a hijabi woman or a queer hijabi woman moving down the street and how they're perceived in terms of space they occupy. But even just for me as like a man having male privilege, there was this feeling that someone has, for whatever reason, internalized the belief that their space is more valuable than mine, that to move through the world for them is a right, whereas for me, like, there's this, no, you shouldn't be where I am, or you're almost taking up the space that you shouldn't be in. It's funny because that's on a pavement, but we also see like the same kind of dynamic in boardrooms and in top positions in companies with all of that in terms of, well, who has the right to be in a certain space? How is it racism and not ignorance? Because I would say that on what happens is that people internalize the ideas that someone occupies more space than another, or someone should be there and they have the right to be there. And in that, internalize sort of beliefs about themselves. Ignorance would be to say, oh, I didn't know that I was moving you out of the way, right? Or I didn't know that I was doing that. However, when that happens, when that's one person, fine. When it's a collective experience happening several hundred times for not just me, but loads of other people, it's something a lot wider than that.
I think that we're on a path of recognition, hopefully reconciliation, learning, and adaptation of our own behaviors. Do you feel that?
Yeah, I think it's tough to say something when there's like a moment happening. I would say that right now, across the world, there seems like there's this moment of recognition happening. And it's really hard to see like where that's going to go, or how long that moment's going to last, or what the impact of that moment's going to be. And I hear what you're saying about like progress and things getting better. My question always on that is, yeah, but at what rate, and kind of for who and where, and who else isn't also experiencing that same rate of progress?
With the murder of George Floyd and the explosion of the Black Lives Matter protests around the world, How were you and your communities able to balance the protests with the lockdown guidelines?
Yeah, that is a hard one. I talk with people about this all the time. So for me, I went to one of the protests in central London, and it was the first time throughout the whole lockdown that I'd left like my literal area in West London, other than like going to shops or going to the warehouse. And it was strange actually, because I was like, wow, I felt like I was going on an adventure. I hadn't gone far. Well, I was just going to London. It's not even, I was on one train. And I felt the need to go despite all of this fear around like going, because I wanted to feel a sense of healing by being around other people who felt the same. And there was like a debate that we had between people as to what's morally right here, like what's the right thing to do. Do I want to like being at home is about protecting a black life because I like being in my own house and looking after myself, but being outside is also about the cause of protecting black life. So it's which one's more important, and it's a real personal decision. You know, there was no right or wrong for anyone in what they did. But for me, I definitely felt I just wanted to go once. Normally, I would show up for days on end and keep going to things. But I think in this moment, it was I just want to see. I just want to experience this for myself. And I got what I needed. And I didn't feel that I needed to go to the others because I knew that other people would, which was cool.
Yeah.
Like I knew that other people would show up for them. And what was amazing, actually, and I really want to bring this up, was different to any other protest that I've been to for Black Lives Matter. There was way more young people than ever, like so many. I don't know if it was because they were all like out of school so they could go, but there was also a whole range of different people, like a whole range of demographics.
I want to ask you if you can give a few words to our viewers, our listeners, about what we can do in the fight against racism.
Yeah, a few things. One is to not see it, if you are white, to not see it as a fight that is someone else's, but to see it as a fight that is yours. If you are non-white, however you are non-white and whoever you are, is to really look after yourself, I think, particularly in experiences of racism, and also, again, see racism as whilst relevant to everyone. I think in this world and in this context, we talk about like Afrophobia or a system of anti-black racism to kind of see the differences in racism and how they operate. I'd also say just to read books by black authors that aren't just about racism. You know, like I think everyone did that thing where they went on Amazon and bought like you know, why I'm no longer talk to white people about race, or bought like a book that was written by a black author but only about racism, which is cool, like do that work, but also just read a novel, just buy a kid's book. You know, if you've got children, show them characters who are non-white in their reading, in their pictures, in their storybooks. Watch films, you know, listen to podcasts. And there's so much creative stuff out there that I think people often believe is, oh, that's just for like black people, or that's just for Asian people. But it's not. Like, it's a story by an Asian person or by a black person. Doesn't mean it's just for black people, you know. And the last thing I'd say on that is to put your comfort second in moments where things might be said or happening. And I think we can all think of like a micro example of something that's said that was awkward and no one challenged it because it was too awkward. But actually, if we just didn't, you know, if we didn't just put our awkwardness and our comfort first and we challenge things in the moment, then maybe we could all start shifting the culture towards one that's more anti-racist.
I want to move on to kindness in our communities and beyond. One of the things that we have seen happening across the world is the spread of people supporting one another. Can you give me any examples of how these acts of kindness are going on within your community, or perhaps you've experienced yourself?
Yeah, I love that question. I love kindness. Kindness makes me happy. My girlfriend is an A&E nurse, so during this pandemic was super busy and at work all the time. And there was a mosque, I think not too far away from the hospital that she works at, who every single day were dropping off like loads and loads and loads of ready meals of curry for the nurses and for the staff in the hospital so that they could have something to eat whilst they were working extra shifts and doing all the hours possible. And she said it was amazing because, you know, actually, I think so they'd never really interacted with this mosque before. Quite a lot of their staff, being nurses, are not white, and they're getting all this sort of food brought in by a local mosque, which was, she said, if they didn't have that, they don't know what they would have done because there was nowhere open to get food anyway.
Your blog gives some particularly good advice on coping with mental health difficulties. I used to be a mental health nurse and know how important it is. Can you give a few words of advice to our listeners, our viewers, on how to get good mental health during this crisis?
If you can leave the house, if you have that ability to do so, just to go for a walk, and just be outside and connect with nature for a little bit. Get a little bit of exercise, even if you can't leave your house indoors. What can you do? There's loads of sort of YouTube videos on like yoga. I tried, I just fell over too much, but it helps.
Yeah.
Doing whatever you can, sort of physical in your house as well, if you can't leave. Also, my thing, like I think we were talking about the importance of staying connected with other people, particularly at this time. You can be, if you are shielding or isolating or quarantined, you can just get stuck with yourself or whoever else you live with and forget that there's like a whole world of other people to talk to. Just where possible, reach out, even if it's an old friend.
We've listened to you and you have been a wonderful speaker and you have given people pause for thought. What would be your final words to our listeners?
I think challenge yourself. And by that, I mean, whether it's around like racism or stepping out of your comfort zone to do something new, really just push yourself into things that are uncomfortable and see what you can learn from it. That's what I'm going to leave you with.
Perfect. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for watching this vlog, listening to our vlog. Bilal, thank you for being our guest today. It has been wonderful talking with you. And from all at Global Acts of Unity, see you again.